Let's go.
Hello, everyone. So, my name is Angus, and today I'm going to be talking about the economics of early childhood development. So, before I get into the talk proper, I'd like to try and motivate the topic a wee bit by asking the following question. How many more times more likely am I to attend university if my parents had attended university compared to the hypothetical world where my parents had not? So, in other words, how many more times more likely are children of parents who attended university to attend university themselves compared to parents who only had high school education? Any guesses? Anyone want to hazard a guess?
10.
3.5 times more likely. So, instead of hoping you'd go under there, I could go over. So, 71% of children with university-educated parents attend university, whereas only 21% of children with low-educated parents do. You might ask, what has this got to do with early childhood development? Well, to understand why such large disparities in attainment exist, we have to understand the formation of human capital, which inevitably determines whether or not you attend university. Understanding how human capital forms is essentially the question that early childhood development and the economics of early childhood development aims to answer. So in this talk, I'm going to try and talk about why such large disparities exist, and also explain some of the ways in which government can intervene to stop such disparities existing. So in this lecture, I'm going to cover 3 broad points, and if there's 3 broad points I want you to take away, these are it. I want to talk about the case for government intervention in early childhood development. Again, going back to arguments of equity and efficiency, which I'm sure you've already heard today. I also want to talk, given that government might want to invest in early childhood, when is the optimal age to invest? And finally, I want to talk a little bit about how research can inform policy, specifically the case of randomized control trials. So, before I get any further, I should really define what I mean by early childhood development. Development is a very nebulous concept, has many different facets to it. In this lecture, I primarily want to think about 2 broad dimensions of development that are cognition, so things like problem solving, IQ, logical reasoning, and social emotional development, things like sociability, determination, and motivation. There are, of course, loads of other domains which are very important, but when we're thinking about development in this lecture, I want you to primarily think about these 2 broad cognitive and social emotional ones. So, what is the case for government intervention in early childhood development? Well, again, as I've already mentioned, it's going to come down to 2 broad arguments, one of efficiency and one of equity. So this will be a recurring theme in the lectures today. We're often going to be talking about these 2 bases of arguments. On the efficiency side, there is an argument that there's market failure prevents efficient allocations of investment in children in the economy. So this is going to be due to a variety of different things. It could be down to externalities, imperfect information, credit and time constraints, which I'll talk about in a moment. The other argument comes down to equity. Equality of opportunity is a fundamental principle which many governments espouse and want to promote. If the distribution of investment is highly skewed, then governments may want to intervene to reallocate investment towards those worse off in society. So I'll now go through both of these arguments in turn and really bring them into the argument of early childhood. So first things first, the efficiency argument. So we know that parental investments are highly important for determining a child's developmental outcome. What does investment mean in the case of a young child? Well, it could be things such as schooling or care choices for children of school age. For younger children, it could be things such as play materials spent with the child at home, language used with the child. All of these things are key determinants of child development in early life. We also know that there's a variety of reasons where parents may underinvest in their children relative to what a hypothetical competitive economy would do or what a social planner would want. So one reason this might be the case is positive externalities on child investment. So there's a variety of ways in which investment in a child, the benefit is captured for society as a whole as opposed to the individual. One prominent example of this is reduced crime. There's some studies out there which show that investment in deprived kids, in this case the states, at a young age in kindergarten, when you follow those kids up 20, 30 years later, they've committed less crime. That's a benefit to society as a whole, which is not captured by the parent when they decide to invest in early childhood. A second reason why parents may underinvest in their children is the so-called lack of altruism. So this is not to say that parents do not care about their kids, it's not what I'm implying at all. But rather, the fact is that children don't choose the investment decisions themselves, rather parents make that investment decision for them. So in this sort of hypothetical parental utility function, if the parents' weight on their child's development is lower than the child would place themselves in their own development, then parents will underinvest relative to a social optimum. A third reason why parents may underinvest in child development is incomplete information. So it's often unclear, or parents may lack information on, the importance of investment at a young age or the optimal way to invest. This is also, given that it's an active area of scholarly debate, this very well may be the case that parents simply don't know exactly what the best ways to invest in young infants are. And finally, credit and time constraints might also be important. So if I think giving my child a maths tutor is important, I have to borrow money to pay for that maths tutor, but I cannot, then I'm not going to be placing the amount of investment I would want to. Government can get around these in sort of classical ways. So one, it can reduce the cost of investment in children. It can provide subsidies, free access to childcare, things like preschool, as well as books, toys, and learning materials. It also increases the perception of the benefits, so get that information side. So we can have information campaigns, home visiting programs to help teach parents about the importance of early childhood development and help stimulate investment in children. What does this look like in a sort of classic price-quantity graph sort of way? Becky will talk about this more later, I'm sure, and have a better explanation for it. But here on my x-axis I have quantity, my y-axis I have price. Before government intervention, I equate the private marginal cost with the private marginal benefit. I end up at point E1. Notice E1 only produces Q1 of investment in kids, which is lower than the optimal point for the social planner, which is E star, where private marginal cost is equated to social marginal benefit. To get to this optimum quantity, we introduce a subsidy, which reduces the private marginal cost curve from here down to here, and we end up with the subsidy P star to P2. So you might say, well, this is all great in theory. What does it look like in practice? So I'm now going to introduce a very famous trial from the 80s in Jamaica, which I'll come back to a couple of times in my presentation today. Essentially as an example of how intervening with disadvantaged kids can have a long-term benefit. It's in a developing country, it's in Jamaica, but these sort of results are replicated all over the world. So what this study is it looked at kids between the ages of 9 and 24 months, so very, very young infants, and gave them a weekly home visit over 2 years. So again, we're looking at so-called stunted kids, so kids who have been persistently nutritionally deprived over the course of their life. And what this intervention entailed was home visitors would go into the household with the mother and the child, play some stimulating game or activity with them, teach the mother how to play that game, give them the materials to play that game with the child over the course of the week, and leave them to do it. What I'm going to show now is the graph of the impacts of cognition of that intervention. So on my x-axis I have various measures of, on the x-axis I have time, so we start at 9 to 24 months, we end at 17 to 18 years. Y-axis is some cognitive score, it doesn't really matter that much, but what I would emphasize is that the difference between the kids who received the intervention, that red line, and to those who didn't, is persistently strong and positive. So this kind of intervention does have impacts, and not only in the immediate term, but also 18 years later. So you might say, well look, this is just some cognitive term, what does this mean for us economists? Well, we can follow this up, and we can even go further and look at a variety of outcomes. So again here, it's a bit bad on this white thing. X-axis is age, y-axis is a variety of different outcomes. The pluses here represent a positive effect. What we see is this consistent positive effect on cognitive ability. by the time we're at 17, we're seeing gains in schooling and schooling outcomes. We also see gains in social emotional skills, and maybe, most economists for economists, is we're seeing positive earnings at 22 years. In fact, 25% higher wages for kids in the stimulated groups relative to those who weren't stimulated. So government interventions or programs like this can work, and is something that should be considered if we care about the efficiency argument for investment. So enough with efficiency for now, on to equity. We know early childhood outcomes are very strongly correlated with socioeconomic status. And furthermore, large gaps in development open up at very, very early ages. So I'm now going to show you a graph of, again, x-axis is age, y-axis is some score of cognition for kids in Bogota, Colombia. It's going to be two lines, one from the highest income quartile, one from the lowest. I want you to focus on the difference between those two lines over time. So what we see here is that 6 months, we have some difference between the richest and poorest. But what's more, by the time we get to 42 months, this gap has tripled. So socioeconomic status is very, very important to determining these sort of cognitive scores. Why is this happening? Well, most of this comes down to differential investment, as I mentioned earlier. So one famous example from Hart and Risley in 2003, children from lower income households in the States hear up to 30 million fewer words before the age of 3 than those in higher income households. So there's big differences in investment lead to these large gaps in development. So you might say, well, look, again, this is another child development measure. What does this matter in the long run? Well, early childhood outcomes are very strongly predictive of adult outcomes. That university example I said earlier. So there's a variety of evidence on this. In terms of indirect evidence, we know human capital matters, and the formation of human capital is determined in childhood. So my IQ at 22 is quite strongly predictive of my wages at 22, and my IQ at 22 is predicted by my IQ at 4. So the fact that the foundations of skills are laid so early on means that we should be thinking about intervening so earlier on in development. In terms of more direct evidence, we know that adverse shocks, even in utero and early childhood, can predict poorer adult outcomes. So I think Ben will mention some of these later, but things like health shocks in utero, economic shocks in utero predict lower wages and outcomes. And we also know interventions such as that in Jamaica can improve outcomes. So this is evidence of the fact that early childhood outcomes predict adult outcomes and lifetime outcomes. Putting this all together, we can see how early childhood development and poorer early childhood development can prevent social mobility. If there's strong correlation between parental and children's wealth, the rich stay rich and the poor stay poor. And we can create these sort of cycles of intergenerational poverty and inequality over time. So I'll point you to this flow diagram here. If I have poorer early childhood development, and this leads into poorer income into adulthood and then into poverty, when these kids themselves have kids, we continue the cycle. So overall, there's quite a strong equity argument if the government is concerned about equality of opportunity for investing in disadvantaged young kids. Can such interventions work? Well, I'll point you again to the Jamaica example. So this is exactly the same cognition graph I showed you before, with the dark blue and the red line. So these are both stunted kids. I now take a sample of not stunted kids from the same place in Kingston, Jamaica, so kids who are from better off households who aren't nutritionally deprived. What we see is that the intervention halves the difference at 18 between stunted and non-stunted kids. So these sort of interventions can work, and these sort of interventions, when targeted at disadvantaged kids, can help reduce the gap between the richest and the poorest in human capital formation. So if we believe that the government should intervene, there's still a series of questions which we need to answer. Primarily, at what age should the government invest? From the government's perspective, we should be thinking about when is the return highest from this investment? When is the bang for the taxpayer's buck the best? In this presentation, I'm going to be making the argument for investing early, and this is for two fundamental reasons, although I would caveat this that this is a debated point. One, from the medical and psychology literature, we know that the brain develops fastest in the first few years of life. This suggests that the marginal impact of investment is just simply higher at this point. The second point is the dynamic formation of skills. Early investment allows us to reap multiplier effects as children age. So I'll now go through these 2 points in greater detail. But before that, I want to introduce this sort of conceptual framework through which we can think about this. So again, I want to think about 2 types of skills, cognition and social emotional, so CIT and SIT. I want to think about them being produced over time. So if I'm thinking about something produced, what as an economist should I think about? Well, I'm going to start introducing some production functions. So instead of production functions in, say, the traditional sense of a firm where you have labor and capital producing output, I want to be thinking about a series of other inputs, having some functional form, putting them all together and producing cognition. So that's what I'm doing in this equation down here. So what I'm saying is that this function f has a bunch of different inputs. Again, this is quite a stylized version of this. There's many other things we can add here, but just for the purposes of this presentation, let's think about these 5 or so. So one thing that's going to be important is parental characteristics, stuff like education, income, all the rest of that. Other background characteristics are going to be important. How many siblings do I have? Where do I live? Investment, again important. But also, maybe most interestingly, cognition yesterday is going to be important for cognition today. And social-emotional skills yesterday will be important for cognition today. I'll talk about that more in a moment. So on to that first point. We know from medicine and psychology that the earliest years of life, the brain develops faster than at any subsequent stage. So this is a period of so-called synaptic pruning. This is when we shed old synapses in the brain to make room for higher quality ones. So frequently this is referred to as a use it or lose it stage. So if you stimulate the brain during this period and you form new synapses, they stay, but if you don't form new synapses, they sort of go away. This sort of suggests, at least from the sort of medical literature, that stimulation of the brain in these very, very early stages is just simply important, and that the marginal effect of investment on ability, so the marginal product, df by di, is potentially just bigger at very early ages than it is at other places. So that's the first argument for why the rate of return might be highest in earlier ages than later. The second comes down to this dynamic formation of skills. So you might have noticed that this is a little bit more complicated than the sort of classical firms problem and production function. Mostly because in this production function for cognition, we have yesterday's cognition and yesterday's social-emotional skills. What does this mean in practice? Well, this means that skills are self-productive. So the fact that I have CIT minus 1 here means that cognition produces itself. So if I'm smarter yesterday, if I'm better at maths yesterday, I'm more likely to be better at maths today. So that's one effect that the dynamics of skills works through. The second is this cross-complementarity. So for example, if I'm more motivated yesterday, which would be an example of a social-emotional skill, maybe I'm just better at learning. Maybe it's meant that I've finished my homework, etc. So skills can be complementary. So to sort of explicate this a little bit and explain this a little bit better, let's consider a sort of 3-period model of life, or at least educational life, of preschool, primary school and secondary school, of social-emotional and cognitive skills. So again, nothing here has changed. I have my same 5 inputs. Here I'm considering cognition, and I'm also considering social-emotional skills. Now let's think that in the period before preschool, I increased the investment in cognition just by a little bit. So only in cognition I increase the investment there, so that IT minus 1 goes up, therefore cognition in preschool has increased. Great, nice and simple. Now let's go into primary school. We see that if I have a higher cognition in preschool, my cognition in primary school also goes up. So the fact that I've invested here sort of leads through, this is skills being self-productive. So higher cognition in preschool, higher cognition in primary school, higher cognition overall. So this is great. I then move on to social-emotional skills in primary school. So notice here, I now, due to the cross-complementarity of skills, mean that this little bit of investment in cognition in preschool is leading to higher social-emotional skills in primary school. move on to the final period. We see that, again, cognition is self-productive and cross-productive, but also social-emotional skills are self-productive and cross-productive. So what we see is this small investment very early on allows us to have higher investments all the way through life. So this is coming down to that essential problem of investing early can have really, really dynamic effects. And one of the reasons why we see such big disparities between richest and poorest is because if we have big differences in investment early on, then that can tumble through all the way into adulthood. And from these sort of two arguments, we get this classical downward shaping return graph. So on the x-axis, again, I have age. On the y-axis, the rate of return of investment to human capital. What this graph tells me, or is at least theorized, is that the rate of return, because of this dynamic nature of skills, is higher if I invest earlier than it is if I do later. So there's some caveats to this. Obviously, this is a very highly stylized framework that has its benefits that let us think about the problem more concretely, but it may be too much of a simplification. Obviously, we can't just invest in the first year of life and never again. Investments are going to interact with each other. There could be some sort of depreciation in skills if you don't invest sufficiently. So what happens in primary school will also be important. There's also other importance of life, periods of life identified in the medical literature. So for example, adolescence is seen as a key point of brain formation and changes in the brain. And that might just be more important for to invest then as well as investing very, very early on. So before you take away that only early childhood investment is important, there's a bunch of things we should also consider. So let's take a little bit of a step back. What have we learned so far, and what do we know? So there's both equity and efficiency arguments to motivate spending in early childhood. And furthermore, there's some evidence, at least theoretical, that returns to investment at early ages could be greater than that at future ages. But there's a bunch of other things we haven't answered. So we don't know, for example, what's the most cost-effective way to improve early childhood development outcomes? Is there ways to encourage parents to invest more in the development of their children without having to have these very expensive weekly home visits? Could you do sort of advertising campaigns? Could you do anything else? Furthermore, we don't know exactly what ages should be targeted. So there's some suggestion that earlier is better, but we don't know exactly how early. If you're talking about kids just like a few weeks old, maybe you just simply can't invest. It's very, very hard. All of these questions require solid policy evidence. And that's what I'm going to come on to now, is how do we use data to inform this kind of policy? So consider the hypothetical problem of a government which wants to introduce a policy of providing reading books to poorly performing kindergartens. How do we think that the government might evaluate such a policy? So one way it could do it would be to compare, before even introducing the policy, compare schools with and without books. Well, there's a bunch of problems with this. You don't know if there's other unobserved differences between the schools with books and those without. Maybe the schools with books also have better teachers, more motivated teachers. Maybe they've got smaller classroom sizes. Maybe the students are more motivated. You simply don't know. So we can't do it that way. You might say, well, maybe the next way we could try is just implement the policy and then compare schools before and after. Well, there's a bunch of problems with this as well. You don't know if there's some underlying time trend. Maybe schools are getting better over time. You don't want to attribute that to books. Well, that's out the window. Well, another way you can think about it is, well, why don't we compare schools before and after, between schools, with and without the books, something called a difference in difference approach. Well, this is the best estimation strategy yet, but you're still relying on the common trends assumption. You're assuming that the difference between schools with and without books, without the introduction of books, would follow the same trend. All of these come down to this sort of more formal problem of the correlation between the implementation of the program and your unobserved error term. How are we going to get around this? Well, as I've already mentioned, the key challenge is identifying the correct counterfactual. We don't know what would have happened in the same kindergarten that received books in an alternative world where they didn't do them. And as I'm hinting at the cartoon here, we're going to try and get around this problem, and a way we often get around this problem is using randomized control trials to create this parallel universe for which we can create a valid comparison group. How this works in practice is we take a bunch of schools and we randomly assign half of the schools to get textbooks, the so-called treatment group, and half of them not to, a control group. What this means is that in expectation, there's no systematic differences between the two. The fact that there's no systematic differences between the two in expectation means that the control group, after the implementation of the policy, provides a valid counterfactual comparison group. It means that I can simply compare the means of these two schools, or two groups of schools, to get a valid estimate of the causal effect of the policy. So here we've solved the problem of not having a valid counterfactual. So you might think everything's dandy. However, there's a series of limitations to using RCTs, which I'll go through now. The first is that while treatment and control groups should be the same in expectation, it means that sometimes if you have small enough samples, they're simply not balanced in reality. This is a problem particularly with small samples. The bigger the sample is, the less of a problem this is. The second is one of internal versus external validity. What do I mean by this? Well, often applied economists are worried about things called internal and external validity. What internal validity means is that the estimation equation you're using is really getting at the thing you're saying it's using. RCTs are really good at this. RCTs, because of this randomization by the researcher, really are getting at that causal effect of the policy. However, the external validity of RCTs, the ability of you to apply that intervention somewhere else and say that you're going to get the same effect, is sometimes very highly questioned. So RCTs often use very small geographical units. They don't have very diverse samples. It's not at all clear that if you implemented the same policy from one place to another place, that you'll get the same effect. There's also other big problems with RCTs. For one, not all interesting questions you can answer them. They can't answer them with RCTs. For example, if I wanted to see the effect of a change in the interest rate, I can't take a hypothetical UK where they didn't increase the interest rate compared to one which did. This doesn't happen. Other ones would be for ethical reasons you can't do it. So, for example, if I wanted to see the effect of smoking on long-term health, I couldn't take a bunch of kids, tell half of them to smoke and tell half of them not to. Just wouldn't be allowed, or really that ethical. Or I couldn't do the same thing with foreign aid. So I couldn't randomly increase foreign aid to some places, not another. I mean, that would just be unethical. And a final point, and as someone who is involved in the running of RCTs, very, very important, is that they cost a lot and they take a lot of time and money and a lot of effort. So RCTs, so they solve the problem of evaluation, but they have a bunch of limitations to them, which we should bear in mind before we go RCT gung ho. A final major drawback to RCTs is they don't tell you why an intervention has worked. So thinking back to our causal framework earlier, what has changed in this equation that means that cognition is higher? So thinking back to the Jamaican example, what is it about this home visiting which is making cognition higher in the long run? Is it a change in it could be a change in any of these arguments. So there's two channels fundamentally which we think this could work. We think this could be a change in the production function F. So maybe kids in the intervention are simply more productive in their investments. By this I mean maybe teaching mothers how to play stimulating games for their kids means that they're better at using the investments they already have. Maybe those investments are simply more productive. Another argument, or another way that the intervention could work, would be through a change in the level of investment. So maybe parents simply invest more in their children if they've been given this treatment. If I do the classic RCT evaluation, I simply don't know the answer to this question. However, the benefit of being an economist is that we have the theoretical tools to deal with this. So what we can do is we build something called a behavioral model or a structural model and apply it to the data. What does this mean really in practice? Is, well, I can apply some economic theory about the household and with budget constraints. So I write out the maximization problem, I write out the utility function, I write out the budget constraint, and then I solve it using the data I have from my RCT. So in practice, this means assuming a functional form for f, So for example, a subdoglus. So our functional form f has now got some writable or expressible function. And I make a series of assumptions about how the household behaves. So the utility maximizing, they care about their children, etc. And then solving this model, using the data with some sort of maximum likelihood or complicated econometric method. What this allows us to do is allows us to directly answer the questions I posed in the previous slide. I know exactly how to test for differences in the production technology. I have the parameters, I can test for differences. It also means that I can test for differences in investment. What applying structure means, as much as we're making a bunch of assumptions about the way that humans work, it allows us to get deeper into the reasons why different types of interventions work, which is incredibly important for informing public policy. So evidence from other home visiting programs show that the increase in cognition is often driven by an increase in investment rather than a change in the production function itself. But broadly, what I take away from this is why it's important that there's economists working on problems like this. It lets us combine multiple approaches and bring lots of different strengths together. There's still unanswered questions, however. We don't know exactly why parents increase their investment. What is it about this sort of weekly visit which encourages them to do so? And we don't know if there's easier or cheaper ways to encourage this kind of behavior. And this is actually one of the programs we're working on at the moment. It's another WRCT we're running in India, where we're trying to do everything a bit cheaper, trying to make it scalable and usable in developing country contexts. So in summary on this point on RCTs, they're very useful in solving the evaluation problem. So if I want to evaluate that hypothetical program of books in kindergartens, RCTs are really getting at that causal effect. However, they have a serious number of limitations, and therefore are best complemented with other methods such as structural or behavioral modeling. So just to wind up my talk today and to summarize what we've learnt and what I've hopefully convinced you of, is that there's very good reasons for government intervention in early childhood development related to efficiency and to equity. Earlier interventions are also likely to have higher returns, both due to higher marginal product of investment and also this dynamic complementarity I talked about earlier. And finally, I hope I gave you a bit of an insight into how research into this area, aided by RCTs, informs the design of early year policies. And that broadly wraps up my talk for today. Thank you for listening. I have a bunch of extra references if you want to read them.